Today, we're going to explore one of the most interesting and influential groups mentioned in the Bible, the Chaldeans. Now, when many people read the Bible, they might gloss over this term, thinking it's just another ancient people group. But the Chaldeans played an absolutely crucial role in biblical history, and understanding who they were helps us understand God's plan for His people, the nature of divine judgment, and the unfolding story of redemption. We'll answer three key questions. Who were the Chaldeans? Why does the Bible mention them so frequently? And what was their specific role in God's redemptive plan? By the end, you'll see that the Chaldeans weren't just a footnote in history. They were central players in one of the most dramatic periods of biblical history. Let's start with the basics. The Chaldeans were an ancient people who lived in southern Mesopotamia, in what we would today call southern Iraq. Specifically, they inhabited the southern portion of Babylonia, in the marshy lowlands around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was an area roughly 400 miles long and 100 miles wide, a fertile region that would become the heartland of one of the ancient world's greatest empires. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Chaldeans weren't originally from this area. They were migrants. Between the 11th and 9th centuries before Christ, waves of West Semitic-speaking peoples moved into Mesopotamia from the Levant. The Chaldeans were among these groups, settling in the far southeastern portion of Babylonia, primarily along the left bank of the Euphrates River. For centuries, they remained a semi-nomadic tribe, living alongside other peoples in the region. But over time, something remarkable happened. As Babylon developed as a political and cultural center, the Chaldeans grew in power and influence. By the time we get to the later periods of the Old Testament, the term Chaldean had evolved to mean more than just an ethnic group. It began to refer to a social class, specifically a class of highly educated people. This is crucial to understand. When you read the book of Daniel, for instance, and you see references to the Chaldeans, the text is often referring to the learned advisors, the wise men, the astrologers, and astronomers who served in the king's court. These weren't just educated people, they were the intellectual elite of the ancient world. They kept detailed astronomical records for over 360 years. They were masters of mathematics, astrology, and what we might call the sciences of their day. The Babylonians, under Chaldean rule, made Babylon the intellectual center of Western Asia. The famous hanging gardens, the astronomical observations, the mathematical achievements, all of this flourished under Chaldean culture. These were sophisticated, intelligent, powerful people. But there's one more essential piece to their identity. The Chaldeans eventually became rulers. In the late 7th century BC, a Chaldean dynasty rose to power and ruled Babylon. This is the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and it would become one of the most significant empires in biblical history. Now that we know who they were, let's talk about why the Bible mentions them so frequently. The term Chaldeans, or related terms, appear approximately 66 times in Scripture, with the heaviest concentration in 3 books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel. The very first time we encounter the Chaldeans in Scripture is actually in connection with the patriarch Abram. Genesis 11:28 tells us that Abram's brother Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then in Genesis 11:31, we read that Abram's father, Terah, took his family and left Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. And in Genesis 15:7, God identifies himself to Abram by saying, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it." This is profound. The entire story of God's chosen people begins with a departure from the land of the Chaldeans. God called Abram out of this sophisticated, advanced civilization to follow him to an unknown land.
Abram left behind the learning, the culture, the security of Chaldean society to walk by faith. This sets up a pattern we'll see throughout Scripture. God's people are called to be separate, to trust Him rather than human wisdom and power. But the Chaldeans don't disappear from the biblical story. In fact, they come roaring back in one of the most dramatic and painful periods of Israel's history, the Babylonian Exile. Fast forward about 1,500 years from Abram. The nation of Israel has been established. God has given them the promised land. He's raised up kings like David and Solomon. The temple has been built in Jerusalem. But Israel has a persistent problem. They keep turning away from God to worship idols. Despite repeated warnings from prophets, despite periods of revival and reformation, the people continue in their rebellion against God. And this is where the Chaldeans re-enter the story in a major way. God, in His sovereignty and justice, decided to use the Chaldeans as His instrument of judgment against His disobedient people. The prophet Habakkuk records God's shocking announcement. In Habakkuk 1:6, God says, "For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own." God describes them as dreaded and fearsome, and says their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. This wasn't a random historical accident. This was divine orchestration. God was deliberately raising up the Chaldean-led Babylonian Empire to punish His people for their unfaithfulness. And that's exactly what happened. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldean king of Babylon, besieged Jerusalem. The city fell. The temple, Solomon's magnificent temple, the dwelling place of God's presence, was destroyed. The walls were torn down, and the people of Judah were carried away into exile in Babylon, the land of the Chaldeans. This was catastrophic. This was the worst disaster in Israel's national history up to that point. Everything they had known was gone. Their land, their temple, their independence, all taken by the Chaldeans. So, what role did the Chaldeans play in God's larger plan? Why did He use them specifically? Let me give you 3 key points. First, the Chaldeans were instruments of divine judgment. This is uncomfortable for us to think about, but it's clearly taught in Scripture. God is sovereign over nations. He raises up kingdoms and brings them down according to His purposes. The Chaldeans weren't acting independently. They were fulfilling God's will, even though they didn't know it. In 2 Kings 24, we read about how the Lord sent Chaldean raiders against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord proclaimed by His servants the prophets. Jeremiah prophesied extensively about the coming Chaldean invasion. This wasn't a surprise to God, it was His plan. And this is crucial. God's use of the Chaldeans didn't excuse their own sins. Second, the Chaldeans were themselves subject to God's judgment. The same prophets who announced Judah's punishment also prophesied against Babylon. Jeremiah 51 contains extensive prophecies about Babylon's fall. God says, "After 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity." This teaches us something profound about God's justice. He can use sinful people to accomplish His purposes, but they remain accountable for their own sins. The Chaldeans weren't innocent victims. They were proud, brutal conquerors who trusted in their own strength and wisdom rather than in God. And God promised to judge them for it. And He did. Just as God said, after 70 years, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians in 539 BC. The Chaldean dynasty ended. The empire that seemed invincible was destroyed, just as God's prophets had said. And third, The Chaldean exile served a redemptive purpose in God's plan. This is perhaps the most important point. The exile wasn't just punishment, it was purification. God used this devastating experience to cure his people of their idolatry once and for all. After the Babylonian exile, Israel never again engaged in widespread idol worship. The exile taught them, in the most painful way possible, the consequences of abandoning God. Moreover, even in exile, God was with his people. The book of Daniel shows us faithful Jews like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, serving in the Chaldean court, maintaining their faith, and being witnesses to God's power in the heart of pagan Babylon. God didn't abandon his people among the Chaldeans. He preserved them, refined them, and eventually brought them home. So, what can we learn from the story of the Chaldeans? First, God is sovereign over all nations and all history. The rise and fall of empires is in his hands. Second, God takes sin seriously. He will judge rebellion, even among his own people. But his judgment is always purposeful, aimed at restoration and redemption. Third, human wisdom and power, no matter how impressive, and the Chaldeans were impressive, cannot stand against God. The Chaldeans thought they were unstoppable. They were wrong. And finally, God is faithful. He keeps his promises both of judgment and of restoration. He told his people through Jeremiah that the exile would last 70 years and then he would bring them home. And he did.
The story of the Chaldeans reminds us that we worship a God who is both just and merciful, who disciplines those he loves, and who works all things, even the rise and fall of empires, for the good of his people and the glory of his name.